I guess if there's one company that over the last kind of 3 or 4 years has sort of characterized sort of the amazing growth of blockchain games, it has been Animoca Brands, which is, previously was a free-to-play mobile game company out of Hong Kong, and in sort of 2017, 2018, was one of the first sort of established companies to really sort of get blockchain games, and then since then it has really sort of deployed and operated very aggressively in terms of its own companies. It's acquired a whole bunch of companies. I guess of its companies, the Sandbox is the best known. But then over the last year or so, Animoca Brands has sort of really changed from being a company that owns other companies to being a, I guess you're a super investor now. Yeah, aren't you? So you've invested in, is it? I can't remember. Is it over 150 companies, something like that?
That's correct.
Over the last kind of 4 years, and then you've just announced. I can't even remember which round it was. 358, I'm guessing, something like that. 8888.
That's right.
$359 million was your last funding round, and now you are sort of very aggressively deploying that, and your leading round, which is something you hadn't really done before. But I'm going to stop talking. You can hear me at least.
I can hear you. Yes. Yes.
Can you see as well? Is there a camera somewhere? Oh, good. Okay. Good. So Yat is the chairman of Animoca Brands, and you're going to be talking about why NFTs are the foundation of the open metaverse. So I shall leave it to you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, even if I can't be there in person. And as John kindly introduced us, I'm the chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands. And very quickly talking about sort of why NFTs are the foundation of the metaverse. And you've probably heard a bunch of things around that. So maybe let me just quickly go a little bit back in time and actually talk about sort of what we define as sort of the metaverse and why sort of NFTs are important. Of course, it's the buzzword everywhere, and most recently, even with the incredible acquisition that Microsoft is doing with Activision, it's all about the metaverse. We would say, though, that the beginnings of the metaverse really started many, many years ago in the 80s to what some of us who are a bit older in the room will have grown up with, the likes of, going on CompuServe. And I wanted to share this ad because actually, when you see this was in the 80s. And we already talked about sort of visions of the future back then. Of course, it was just text. There was no graphics or anything like this. But we were already traveling basically into different worlds and let our imaginations basically run wild. In a very small base, back then, CompuServe had maybe tens of thousands of users, eventually had hundreds of thousands, maybe was into the low millions. But that's kind of a thing back then in the 80s, moving to the 90s. And these were the devices that we basically connected to, super primitive acoustic couplers and modems. But of course, we've come a long way from where we are today with this. And these gaming devices, which really, I think, trained us and led us to sort of what we now consider the metaverse, has now grown to 3.2 billion gamers, as you all know, and an industry that is larger than music and film combined. And the other thing is, of course, is that the amount of time that we spend online, which I think is really critical here, is actually the majority of our time is online. Even if we may be physically present in a place, the moment we touch our smartphone, the moment we go on our computer, we are actually having our attention go somewhere that is entirely virtual already. So arguably, we are already digital dependents, if you will. In fact, imagine what happens to you if you actually no longer have access to your smartphone. And so that basically means the digital life and the digital world is really important to us. So what is the metaverse and what we define as the true metaverse? So we absolutely insist that this is not the actual metaverse, despite that some people might say it's about VR and about access online. And while it is a part of that, we actually think that the true metaverse is about data ownership. And let me describe that a little bit here, because thereafter, all the other experiences that we have with VR and AR are layers that sit on top of that, which is why we say that property rights and NFTs are the foundation of the open metaverse. Data is the world's most valuable resource. And it's valuable because of the fact that it powers basically the resource of basically everything that is digital today. Data is the engine of companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all of the biggest companies in the world. This used to be oil. This used to be energy back in the days when we needed that. And oil and energy is still important, but it is no longer the world's most valuable resource. But the thing is, what's interesting about this valuable resource is that it comes from our time. It comes from our ideas, from our creativity, from our attention. And one of the issues on this one, of course, is that as we spend time, normally when we work on something, our labor is our time. That time is derived in the form of salary or in the form of some kind of compensation that we receive. But as time went on through history, actually, this whole concept of, owning and sort of the fruits of your labor started to move away, because in history, when you were a farmer, you could sort of, you grow your apples, the apples were yours, for instance, right? But now capital, which is essentially the platforms and the investors, they own the machines, and we work in those machines, and actually they monetize, and they basically take all of our labor and actually monetize it far more deeply. And in particular cases, when you go to online, actually that labor is entirely free, because we are actually now a resource. Every single one of us, when we play a game, which is countless hours, when we're basically spending time on Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, WeChat, whatever platform you say, we basically provide the data in the form of information, and that becomes knowledge. And that knowledge is we as humans have always sort of been able to process, and that becomes wisdom, and that becomes experience, and we can get jobs for this because we have knowledge, right? But basically the platforms, because of the awesome power of AI and deep learning, and the speed of computing, is now able to mine that kind of knowledge and power at essentially 1 billion users a second. And that basically makes them the most powerful company in the world. But the problem is that if all of us actually stop using these platforms, or if we no longer play free-to-play games and only the paying players play, actually what happens to the environment of that platform? It declines. People won't pay. Facebook can't cancel advertising. It doesn't know anything about us. So in fact, all of us are inadvertently laborers in the platform that is essentially a Facebook or a Call of Duty or whatever system that is out there. And it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to Facebook. It belongs to the platforms. And so we live in an age of a kind of digital colonialism. And today, actually, we are digital dependents. We are digital serfs in essentially the kingdoms of digital platforms. I think this is best illustrated when, for instance, what happens when Apple doesn't like you. They just remove your apps. For all of us game developers, that is a horrible situation, which we ourselves have experienced. And in that situation, again, who are we dependent on? Was it better for our customers? Is it actually better for us? Or is it really better for the platforms? And this exists all the time, basically, and it happens to all of us, whether it's on Twitter or on Facebook or whichever. And so as a result, we are not actually free to do what we want in the digital world, despite what the original promise of Web 1 was. In this Web 2 world, basically, we live in digital kingdoms. This, of course, has created disproportionate value for the kingdoms themselves when you take a look. And I just wanted to illustrate this because essentially in under 2 decades, we have gone from the biggest companies that were energy companies of market caps that were already tremendous, none of them reaching more than essentially $500 million, to essentially, just the top companies, literally all of them hitting $1 trillion. Facebook recently declined a little bit, but also the size of the revenues in question here are enormous. They are larger than the many countries out there, and the cash reserves of these companies basically rival the cash reserves of some mid-sized nations here. And you take an example of the world's biggest gaming company outside of Tencent, Activision, with 8.8 billion revenue and essentially 2.4 billion free cash flow, right? This at a time when the rest of the world is really struggling, not just because of COVID, but over time, basically, the value of labor has declined. And actually what's really happened here is that we no longer, we have rising wealth inequality, while basically people who have access to data are in those worlds are doing incredibly well. This is where we think non-fungible tokens as property rights becomes really a big answer to all of this, because non-fungible tokens, because they sit on the blockchain, are basically public goods. That means that data can no longer be controlled by a single party or by a single entity. In fact, actually, it keeps the system honest, because we can now compose, like open source, freely on top of the ownership of others, but in this case through digital assets, whether it's user stories, content creation, or game assets. Ownership is the fundamental, because through ownership, we can build platforms on top of it. In fact, it is because we can have ownership, for instance, in this case of cars, whether they be digital, which is what we like to do, or physical, it allowed for the growth of things like Uber and Lyft and car wash companies, tire companies, accessorization, drivers. The industry around automotive industry is actually far, far greater than the sale of the car itself. And that's because you're able to do so in a permissionless fashion. Basically, people can innovate on top of it. When you take a look at, for instance, what happened with Axie Infinity, it wasn't Axie Infinity itself that sort of went into the Philippine market. It was a group of other people that eventually became Yield Guild Games that innovated on top of the ownership of the Axies to create a new business, essentially like an Uber or a Lyft, on top of the ownership of others without permission from the platform. Which basically means that in this construct, because it's on blockchain, assets can transfer and interoperate in other places. The key important point here, though, is not that we have to, as a game developer, design a utility in another platform. This is sometimes often misunderstood as to, does it make sense? Does it not make sense? Should I use my sword in World of Warcraft and then use it in some other game? What's the point in all of this? That's not the point. The point is that it is permissionless, meaning that we now have the freedom as an end user, as well as a service provider, to conduct business. Uber did not need permission from someone who owns a Ford or a Tesla to basically, become a sort of a tool that can be used as a service provider. Nor do we need to have permission to paint our car red, blue, or white, right? We can do whatever we want because we have ownership, which allows for new businesses to construct sort of in ways and creates innovation on top of it. One of my favorite examples is the baby seat in the cars, because baby seats themselves happened 30 years after the car was actually created. And what's interesting about this one, it is somewhat a frivolous example, because nobody in the car industry at the time would have said, oh, we need to have basically a device that can help transport toddlers safely from place to place. But the baby seat now is a fixture in the industry. And in fact, it has informed of the value of the car. It has made the utility of the car more valuable because now it's a family device, and eventually led to things like, basically invention of the, basically the need of a seatbelt and all these other things that created on top of that. So the ownership as a platform can construct and conform a value, and basically is the bedrock of all innovation. If I can't own my house, if you can't own your property, can you get a 20 or 30-year mortgage? You cannot. Financial services cannot be applied. Industries like IKEA would not emerge, right? So the same applies here. This has been missing in the digital world. What that basically means is that basically all of us who used to be content creators in the gaming industry, especially, creating content that would be consumed but have no lasting value because you have no staying power, because they sit in essentially sort of permissioned centralized databases that maybe we don't even control, right? Now become basically actual goods. We dubbed this a few years ago, 4 years ago, we called this content as a platform, right? And so basically now we are content creators, we become asset creators actually. And these asset creators actually turn us also into all the social identifiers that actual assets do today, right? When you buy something, it is not just simply the utility. It also says something about us. Everything that we wear every day physically, whether the shoes, they don't need to be expensive, but we make conscious decisions about the choice of shoes or things we do or clothes that we wear because we want to say something about ourselves. Of course, this is a more extreme example on the sort of more luxury side of things, but actually Bored Apes recently flipped the value of Birkin bags, right? And what's interesting about this example is that actually when you buy this particular kind of social identifier, right, this JPEG, as you will, which is entirely virtual in value, when you buy a Birkin bag, actually, what is the value of a Birkin bag in and of itself, right? When you're buying it, it's not because it's made of a particular material or because it feels nice. 99% of the value is in fact virtual in its construct. It comes from that network effect that is embedded. Non-fungible tokens create network effects. The value of them come from its utility. The value of a car is because you have thousands of service providers coming to it. If the car has only one utility, the car would not be valuable at all. And we wouldn't necessarily be interested in a sports car or in a different kind of car or in cars with nice leather seats because it only has one single utility. But because we can freely innovate on top of these things, we can create new value on top and new innovation. The property rights movement, therefore, also means that you can derive new value from it. I think you've already seen sort of earlier as well as afterwards discussions on all these various applications, so I won't go into them. But the bedrock of this is the fact that we have ownership. Ownership allows to have essentially, platforms like, what Yield Guild Games did in the Philippines, a kind of rental sharing arrangement. Or you can have collateralization of NFTs, because now I know you truly own it and I can't take it away. And I can get the long-term capital benefits, right? You can stake them, you can yield them, you can mortgage them, right? These are all services that third-party companies can now compose freely on top of it. So we think the metaverse has very real parallels to the real world. There's no particular difference in terms of how property rights are constructed basically in the physical world that they ought to be different in the digital world, except that in the digital world, up until we had blockchain, we weren't able to actually truly own the assets and had the rights towards them. So I'll close with a few thoughts here, which is basically when you look at the physical world, property rights actually are the foundation of two main things. One, economic activity. The kind of countries that have basically the best property rights tend to have the best GDP capita per income and also have the best democratic frameworks out there. Because actually when property rights and democracy go hand in hand. In fact, actually the places that have very strong property rights also have better democratic frameworks versus the ones that don't, right? And that's because essentially, in those places, when you you have a minority interest, the more distributed, for instance, property rights are across a society, the better the democratic framework is as well, because there is a reason to defend it as well. And democracy is protected because there's a reason to do so. Hernando de Soto is a sort of, a very famous economist. If you're interested in this topic, it's worth taking a look at. I just wanted to quote this because basically he talked about the billions of people who have the full rights to live in the property, and they live basically, with liberty and democracy, right? But for the billions who do not have such rights, they are unable to leverage their resources to create wealth. It becomes dead capital, right? And they're unable to generate income or growth. And so one of the things here is that when you actually inject property rights in any of those societies, then actually what happens is that it unlocks dead capital and creates value. And that's a perfect example of what's happening in things like play to earn or in other areas of blockchain, because really the property rights unlocks the dead capital that was always there. The energy that we see in free-to-play games, which is essentially the 97% of people or more that are essentially spending their time for free, is a form of dead capital. It is our energy, it is our time that we're spending playing these games for which we do not get paid for. Maybe we don't want to get paid for, but there is actual value for that, right? That value needs to be given back to the kind of people that are spending time, because we are adding to the network effect. 3.2 billion people are making game companies richer, more powerful, and not sharing anything in return. That is dead capital. By unlocking it, new innovation can build on top of that. And in closing on this one, we liken the metaverse a little bit like, what happened when China entered the world. And what's interesting about this is that when this new economy, when this new driver came in, actually what was interesting is that it didn't just grow China as well and gave them basically more property and more rights and more freedoms, in terms of the growth of the economics that were there. But the rest of the world benefited as well because of, goods that were being produced, jobs that were being created, opportunities that came into that. Basically, the opportunity essentially of a mass sort of new wealth basically that came into the rest of the world had equal sort of growth opportunities elsewhere. So we think of this in the same way with the metaverse. And this is the reason why, as Animoca Brands, we have a strategy where we don't just actually sort of build our own products, which is of course, great, like the Sandbox or Gamey, Rev, Limpo, and all the other projects, Phantom Galaxies. But we also invest heavily in what we call, sort of the open metaverse, anything that relates to building sort of open platforms. Because just like the example we gave with the car earlier and many other kinds of property, they all inform of each other's value because they all openly compose on top of each other. And it is not up to us as game developers to decide how it gets composed. It is up to the creation and the creativity of everyone else to come with new ideas, as we have seen in history before. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. That was a really good overview. I don't know if we have any questions in the room. We do have a few. I assume you can hear the microphone. Yeah. Okay. First question then.
Yeah, it's really great that you've actually been able to join us here. My question is, you talked a lot about interoperability, the fact that we are in control of our assets. How do you think gaming companies will combat this issue of us, for example, minting assets on Solana or Wax, and then these games that are supposed to accept those assets, discover those assets being based on Polygon or some other chain?
Okay, so this comes down to authenticity, right? So basically, I know the example I would say is very similar to, a fake Rolex and a real Rolex, right? In fact, I usually live in Hong Kong. Right now, I can't go back because of COVID, but Hong Kong was quite famous for fake Rolexes, right? Which is not a great thing to say. But what's interesting about this is that people don't go around saying, oh, I had a fake Rolex. That's great, right? Most people buy a fake Rolex or fake anything because they actually want the real thing and they want the authenticity of that. And so the same is here. If you are the original game developer and you are the one who, let's say, minted something on Wax or Solana or even on Polygon, right? And someone created a forgery, a fake. the contract address actually stipulates what is real or what is not, right? And so the network effect, actually what happens is that the network effect of the true asset, which is the one that you can use in your game, is yours, right? If someone makes a fake, it may look exactly the same, but it doesn't work in your game, which basically means you can't import it, which also means that if another game company said, oh, I want to use that asset myself, right? It doesn't have the same effect. It doesn't have the same value because it's not interoperable, because you will immediately reject it because it's not actually authentic, right? And I think this is the power of blockchain in and of itself, which is that, it is not so much to say that you can't copy something. In fact, artwork and works and code and all these things get copied. It's about the origination. What is authentic? And therefore, if the community knows what is authentic, in this case, blockchain makes it so at scale, then we can also easily reject it, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Hello. How do you square the circle of decentralized assets on centralized networks? So, we own the assets on the networks, but then the networks fundamentally own everything. So how do we get around that?
So I think the parallel here, and I think a lot of people look at OpenSea and say, oh, isn't that kind of centralized, right? And so I think the interesting thing is that the data sits in your wallet, right, in terms of the actual NFT, and the assets sit on the blockchain. And so does all the transaction records. So you can audit the entire history and the trail. The interface, which is the front end, like an OpenSea, interacts with it and creates some value and allows us, a smooth interaction, or maybe not so smooth sometimes in terms of those transactions, right? So that's sometimes what we view as a centralized aspect, but the assets still sit in our MetaMask. Now, what's interesting is that because the data is open, we can compose on it freely without the permission of OpenSea. In fact, if you look at what happened with LuxRare or SOS, basically, and how they did vampiric attacks on OpenSea, it's a perfect example of how, despite the fact that OpenSea maybe appeared to be actually a closed ecosystem, it is open because they can easily say, hey, all of you who have basically traded on OpenSea with this kind of value or this kind of asset, for the last 6 to 12 months, I'm going to give you some tokens in return for you to come to my platform. It's as if eBay or Amazon had their entire database open for everyone to work on, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? What does that mean? It means that we have more freedom of choices. If OpenSea doesn't do something that we like, guess what? Thousands of new marketplaces will come up and emerge and develop something. And we as customers benefit from that. It also means that actually as a platform, OpenSea and those kind of companies need to do a better job in retaining the customers, not because they create a walled garden to trap us into it and make it expensive for us to leave, but because they have to continue to provide us better value so that we stay there because the data is with us, right? So I think there's a distinction between the front end, which seems centralized, but at the end of the day, as long as the assets are on chain, and the audit trail is on chain, which is what everything on blockchain is, then actually it is decentralized.
I'm going to ask a question following on from that. So I guess I probably know the answer, but I'm interested. So some of the discussion today has been about, particularly for games, we want to focus on user experience and frictionless kind of access and going mass market. And clearly that sort of tips into, do you own your private keys? Is it custodial, non-custodial? So where do you sit on that? Because your argument, which is very sort of lucid and sort of philosophical and broadly I agree with, but clearly there is a sort of a thing there, isn't there, about that works really well. If we all have our own MetaMask, then the world sort of works in your view. But clearly, I assume that we think that's not really going to be the case. So how do you square that?
So I'm kind of sitting on the camp where I think decentralization is a little bit like defending democracy, right? There is some inconveniences around that. When people talk about the cost of a network, the challenge about the cost of the network is that it can't come for free. Democracy is not free, right? We have an institution to protect that. We have a layer that is not straightforward because we need to be able to do that. Opening a bank account, KYC, AML, is not straightforward either. I would argue that actually opening a bank account is way, way harder and more complicated than basically opening up a sort of a blockchain wallet. Philippines is an example of this, right? In rural Philippines, more people have a crypto wallet than they have than have a credit card. And one would argue, wait, those people don't necessarily have university, college education. They're not the kind of people that would normally be a target market for people that have money. And yet here we are, fastest growth market, for MetaMask would be places like the Philippines, for instance, right? So I think there is a distinction there between sort of the implied complexity, right, which I don't think is as complex as perhaps we think it is. In fact, starting games and game tutorials are probably much more complex, right? And game developers are masters, and game designers are masters in essentially uncomplicating the complex, shall we say, for consumer adoption. Now, there is an argument here around people, particularly for people not born in this world, as we say, or sort of emerging, that they want something that can take care of it. There's custodial services and so on. The main point here, like democracy, is you don't need every single person to vote. You just need enough of them to basically to vote, right? And in that context, it's the same. You don't need the whole world to sit in a decentralized platform, but you need enough of them, right? If 20, 30%, or even 40% of the world sit in a decentralized world, then the market economy, the size and the infrastructure is so large that you're forced to basically build on open as well, which means that the centralized platforms are kept honest. The issue is that we moved all of our data to centralized platform when we went from Web 1 to Web 2, which basically meant that suddenly they had control. Facebook didn't start up saying, oh, we want to take over the internet. They just happened to get to that point. And as the classic case is, absolute power corrupts absolutely. When they had the power, they acted in their minority interest against the majority. The whole point is that we need to stay decentralized enough so that the majority can continue to protect its interest.
Good. We have one more. No, I've been told. Sorry, no more yet. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.